So thank you all for being here. I'd like to start by thanking my colleagues, Amanda Arians and Tim Hill, for organizing this week. And I'd also like to thank my collaborator, Dr. Leah Check, for putting up with me. I have immense respect and admiration for all of them, and I'm grateful to learn from them, as we all should be. So let's start with a fact. Our American democracy is diverse by design. And since I study religion, let me push that point a little further. Religious diversity is assumed and protected in our founding documents. For example, in 1787, September, our Constitution was ratified, and in Article 6, Clause 3, the subject of which is loyalty of elected officials, we hear that, quote, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. 4 years later, in December of 1791, the Bill of Rights was ratified, which includes the First Amendment. Therein, we find what we call the free exercise and establishment clauses. Quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. In both of these documents, the founders affirm that there will be religious diversity in our country, that citizens should be free to practice their religion unencumbered by religious or by governmental interference, that citizens don't have to practice a certain kind of religion in order to be an elected official, and that there will be no official state religion. So we see an acknowledgement of and protections for religious diversity in the blueprints for our democracy. But religious diversity doesn't do anything on its own. It's just a fact. What one does with and about that religious diversity is an important and an open question. And at the risk of sounding self-serving, maybe. Yes, at the risk of sounding self-serving, I'd like to suggest that the academic study of religion offers us a constructive and a useful way to deal with that religious diversity. It helps us to identify, examine, and understand religious dangers to, as well as religious resources for, the continuation of American democracy. So let's talk about the dangers first, and I'm just going to mention the most current and present danger, that of white Christian nationalism. So let's unpack that term briefly. Nationalism is usually defined as an ideological movement that places absolute loyalty to a nation state above personal rights and freedoms, especially those of groups who don't appear to share that absolute loyalty, who aren't, quote unquote, patriots. And along with that absolute loyalty, nationalism relies on certain stories or understandings about the identity of their nation state. In the case of white nationalists, that understanding has to do with a racialized version of their nation state, in which white citizens are better than and should hold power over others. Religion is often a component of nationalism and can be a potent motivator. For example, just as Dr. Hill noted on day one of this week, that not all Republicans are to blame for the big lie, but a majority of Republicans believe it, we can note that not all American Christians advocate violence on behalf of a white nationalist cause, but the majority of folks who do self-identify as Christian. And they do so because of a particular understanding of American identity, what we in religious studies refer to as a myth, what sociologists refer to as a deep story that is a mythological version of history. As Philip Gorski and Samuel Perry put it, white Christian nationalism's deep story goes something like this. America was founded as a Christian nation by white men who were traditional Christians who based the nation's founding documents on Christian principles. The United States is blessed by God, which is why it's been so successful. And the nation has a special role to play in God's plan for humanity. But these blessings are threatened by cultural degradation from un-American influences, both inside and outside our borders. They continue. But white Christian nationalism is not just a deep story, not just a myth about what was. It's also a political vision of what should be. First and foremost, of course, white Christian nationalists believe that America should be a Christian nation, or at least a nation ruled by Christians. The deep story, the myth, and political vision of white Christian nationalism are dangerous to our American democracy precisely because they ignore those founding documents I mentioned at the outset of my talk. Catherine Stewart makes this point in her work, writing that white Christian nationalism is not a social or cultural movement. It's a political movement, and its ultimate goal is power. It doesn't seek to add another voice to America's pluralistic democracy, but to replace our foundational democratic principles and institutions with a state grounded on a particular version of Christianity. This is not a culture war. It's a political war over the future of democracy. So under white Christian nationalism, citizens would have to be Christian and the right kind of Christian in order to serve in government. There would be an official state religion, and religions wouldn't be free to practice unencumbered by governmental interference. In more extreme manifestations of white Christian nationalism, not only would non-Christians, or more specifically Jews like me, be targeted for my religious identity, we would also be subject to state-sponsored violence. A religious studies approach to white Christian nationalism helps us to understand the movement's origin in racist Christian evangelical circles, as well as to dissect and understand their use of symbols and language, much of which was on public display at the insurrection in January. The comparative study of religion and violence, something I've been engaged in for over 15 years, allows us to grasp the motives of white Christian nationalists and speculate on more helpful ways to address its growing influence by placing it alongside other examples of religious nationalism, like that of Nazi Germany, South African apartheid, Bosnia, or Russia today. But religious studies can do more than be an investigative tool for this threat to our democracy. It can also provide resources to ensure its continuation. Religious studies requires and breeds not only curiosity, but an empathetic engagement with the practices and beliefs of those who may or may not share your worldview and perspective. That curiosity and engagement is critical for the future of our democracy as it trains us to deal constructively with difference, even difference in how we understand our ultimate concerns. And obviously, religious studies enhances religious literacy, which we understand as both facts about different religions, as well as a way to approach various religions through interpersonal dialogue. All of these attributes, curiosity, empathetic engagement, and religious literacy, help what many scholars see as a crucial way forward: the development of new myths and foundational stories to counteract traditional harmful ones in our country, like the lost cause myth in the postbellum South and the deep story myth underlying white Christian nationalism. The thinking here is that if we can develop new stories that draw upon knowledge of religious traditions that emphasize interreligious engagement, cooperation, and peaceful coexistence, then these might serve as a corrective to the theological and ideological underpinnings of dangers to democracy like white Christian nationalism. For example, we might tell and retell the story of the Inner City Muslim Action Network, or IMAN, a multiracial, Muslim-based community action organization in Chicago that regularly partners with their Jewish neighbors, has opened the Go Green Community Fresh Market with local products to ensure residents can have access to nutritious food, and in 2016 set up the first permanent memorial to Martin Luther King in the city of Chicago. Closer to home, we might tell and retell the story of the Tri-Faith Initiative in Omaha, which, and I'm quoting, brings together in permanent residency a synagogue, church, mosque, and interfaith center on one 38-acre campus in America's heartland. Their goal is simple, and again I'm quoting, to cultivate inclusive environments to advance interfaith relationships and understanding based on a vision of a world in which differences are honored, similarities are built upon, and everyone belongs. The story of these initiatives and groups honor the assumed and protected religious diversity in our founding documents. At the same time, they hold up a model of dialogue, cooperation, and vision that represents a productive engagement with religious diversity aimed at our collective human flourishing. Students of religion are ideally suited to mobilize their religious literacy and empathetic imagination to meet the challenge of crafting new narratives and telling new stories about positive, constructive models of religious diversity. I only pray that we are not too late. Thank you.